When tackling the issue of the Russian Tsarist economy, it's worth bearing in mind that the Russian economy at the time that Alexander II took the throne in 1855 was far behind the economies of Russia's main rivals in Europe, namely Britain, France, Austro-Hungary and Prussia, which was to join with other Germanic states to become Germany in 1871. Russia is and was unique because of its colossal size, which means that there are often huge distances between cities and between small settlements. The vast majority of Russians were agricultural peasants, and for them life was often brutal, short, and centred upon growing enough food to be able to eat. Most of them were not interested in politics, couldn't read, and would have had no idea about what was going on in St. Petersburg or Moscow. As the period of Tsarist rule wore on, more and more peasants made the move from rural Russia to industrial Russia. But right up until 1917 there remained the situation that Russia was primarily an agricultural economy and more people lived outside of cities and towns than in them. And so to the Tsarist industrial economy. The Tsars wanted to catch up to the West, and indeed this was a central point of the thinking of every Russian ruler from 1855 to 1964. So in this way the Tsars and Bolsheviks were similar. They were also similar in their opinions on how catching up was to be achieved, because they all agreed that improving heavy industry would then drag the whole economy in an upwards trend. As everybody who's ever studied this module knows, Alexander II emancipated the serfs, partly at least because he felt it was better to reform from above than to face peasant revolution, but also because he recognised that the continuation of serfdom was holding the Russian economy back. Yet he also knew that emancipation might lead to a larger urban proletariat, as it did. And so he was happy for factory and industrial owners to introduce what was known as a new work discipline, which were strict rules and regulations designed to control the new workforce that had been used to working to nature's clock. Alexander appointed Rutan as his Minister for Finance, who, like many that followed, wanted to improve the Russian economy through an expansion of the railways and through the attraction of foreign capital, which means money, and foreign expertise. This had some success because heavy industry expanded, as did some newer industries such as oil. The Nobel brothers were responsible for the growth of the oil industry that was located in a place called Baku, which is in the Caucasus region and is now the capital of Azerbaijan. Interestingly, oil is still the key export of Baku. Perhaps the most important foreigner during Alexander II's reign was J.J. Hughes, a Welsh industrialist who transformed steel and iron production, and by the start of the 20th century his company was responsible for half of all steel production in Russia. There was even a town called Yuzovo, or probably Yuzovo, which had a population of Welsh immigrants. It had pubs and English-speaking schools as well. Under Rutan, who was Minister for Finance from 1862 to 78, railways expanded from 3,532 kilometres in 1862 to over 22,000 kilometres by 1878. Because of the capacity of the railways to quickly break bulk, which means transport heavy goods, this had a significant positive impact on the economy. In fact, under Rutan, industrial output doubled, and there was an average industrial growth rate of 6%. This isn't far behind the industrial growth rate under Witte during the Great Spurt, which was 7.5% average growth. So if you like, Rutan was Minister of Finance during a big spurt, even if it wasn't quite big enough to be called great. Much of the railway construction was financed through foreign investment, and Rutan had some clever ideas about how to attract foreign investment. He offered tax exemptions. He offered monopoly concessions, which means he gave companies the right to be the only producers of certain goods, which gives them a monopoly of the market, which is where the name of the famous board game comes from. He also offered government bonds for sale, which is when people buy a bond certificate and can cash them in or sell them to somebody else at a later date. When somebody buys a bond, they're basically giving the government money and getting a certificate stating that they've given the government money and that they can get it back. It's a bit like an official IOU note. Anyway, it helped to generate money that could be invested in things like the railways. However, all was not rosy with Rutan's economy, as he had problems with corruption, partly because he agreed that the government would bail out projects that got into trouble, so some companies fixed things so that they could get government money from bailouts. And 3 years before Alexander's death, Rutan was dismissed. However, he'd clearly done some impressive things to prepare the way for the next significant, although not the next Minister of Finance, Witte, who was appointed quite a bit later in 1893. Before Witte, there were two other Ministers of Finance, Bunge and Vyshnegradsky. Bunge was, apart from having a quality name, and I'm probably saying wrong, it should probably be Bunge, or something like that. Anyway, he was surprising, considering he was in office under Alexander III and was quite liberal. For example, he abolished the salt tax and the poll tax, which were two taxes that had an impact on the peasantry. In particular, the poll tax, which was a tax on how many people lived in a household, and it was also a tax that the nobility didn't have to pay, despite them being often the wealthiest. Perhaps Bunge's most significant introduction was the Peasant Land Bank in 1883, which helped ease the burden of massive peasant debt. However, Alexander III blamed Bunge for a dramatic fall in the value of the Russian currency, which was the ruble, and he replaced him with Vyshnegradsky. Vyshnegradsky didn't really do much dramatic, but he did balance the government budget. Perhaps the most important thing to happen under Vyshnegradsky was the introduction of the Mendeleev tariffs on foreign goods, which meant foreign companies wanting to import into Russia had a tax added to those goods, and this helped to generate money for the government. Vyshnegradsky tried to improve government income further by exporting grain, but he also did this when famine threatened Russia, and the terrible famine of 1891 was blamed on Vyshnegradsky, who continued to export grain even when peasants starved to death. So I suppose I did say he didn't do much dramatic as Minister of Finance, but a starving Russian peasant having his grain exported might have disagreed with me. Anyway, he was dismissed, and just 1 year before Alexander III's death, Witte was made Minister of Finance. When Witte took over the Russian economy, it was still dominated by agriculture, and though gains had been made in industry, Russia was still behind their main economic rivals in Europe. Witte said that, quote, "all thinking Russia was against me," which shows how much opposition he faced to what he thought were radical ideas. His ideas were seen as radical because he invested heavily in industry at the expense of agriculture, and when you remember that the nobility that supported the regime were mostly large landowners, you can see why he faced opposition. As you are all probably aware, despite the opposition, Witte was in office at the same time as the Great Spurt. This was caused by a few things. Firstly, he resurrected the emphasis on attracting foreign investment and expertise. Secondly, he took out loans from foreign banks in addition to increasing tax and interest rates, so that the government had more money that they could then invest. Thirdly, he placed the ruble on the gold standard, which meant the value of the ruble was fixed to the gold reserves of the country, and this gave foreign investors more confidence in the Russian currency. Fourthly, he focused all of his efforts on heavy industry. And fifthly, and perhaps also most interestingly, he believed that industrialisation should be planned and managed mainly by the state, with a move away from private enterprise. I say this is most interestingly because there were two periods of significant industrial growth in Russia in the period we have to study. Firstly, this Great Spurt, and also when Stalin transformed the country from a weak, impoverished nation to one that could stand up to the German army of World War II. Stalin believed in massive centralisation and state control in the extreme. Witte, although not using anywhere near the levels of control Stalin introduced, also believed in the state planning and control of industry. The result of Witte's actions were impressive. Coal production doubled, but even more impressively, iron and steel production increased sevenfold. There was just over 29,000 kilometres of railways in 1891, but by 1901 there were over 52,000 kilometres. And income from industry increased from 42 million rubles in 1893 to 161 million rubles by 1897, a colossal increase. Under Witte there were at last signs of catching up with the West. For example, Russia replaced France as the world's third biggest iron producer. It wasn't all good though, and some historians have argued that the Great Spurt is exaggerated. For example, Russia still had 11 times fewer kilometres of railway than Germany, which was of course a much smaller country. The reliance on foreign investment meant that homegrown businesses were stunted, and some historians argue that whilst heavy industry improved, most other aspects of the Russian economy did not. Witta's opposition eventually had their own way and he was replaced in 1903. Witta was brought back though after the war with Japan, but he was brought back as Prime Minister, with Stolyepin as Minister for Finance. From 1909 to 1913, industrial output increased by an average of 7% a year, so Witta also had a hand in the continued development of the Russian economy. Some historians argue that Russia was on the way to catching up with the West when the First World War broke out. Others argue that this was simply not the case. For example, in 1914, Russia's coal output was still only 10% of the output of Britain. Industrial output had improved, but this was largely through manpower, whereas investment in new technologies was poor. Also, because the Russian population substantially increased, there were great pressures on agricultural output, and Witta had neglected agriculture, so there was a real risk of famine. Other historians argue that the fact the Russian economy fell apart during the First World War is evidence that Witta's policies only brought short-term gains, and his policies were risky for the long-term security of the Russian economy. So the Russians wanted their economy to catch up to the West. No one would really argue that they didn't make progress in this respect, but how far behind they were by 1914 is arguable. The biggest periods of progress under Rutan and then Witta were largely financed by foreign investment, and this could have helped to cause the collapse of the Russian economy in the First World War, when foreign attention and priorities were elsewhere. I'm Mr. Otway and you've been listening to an Ossett History podcast.